Okay, what do we have today? Yes, the appendices. In honor of the upcoming Rings of Power show, which I know it's going to be a TV show, and I mostly, if only, do book stuff on this channel. I'm not going to change that, but I'm just too excited, right? It looks too good. I'm too excited. So I'm going to talk about it. So today we're covering the appendices of Lord of the Rings, not the book, the appendices. So, when I was first reading it, there's no recommendation because I mean they just it's not actually a book, right? So it doesn't really need one. And it comes with the book, so you don't have to go buy it separate, right? Okay, so when I was first, this isn't what I first read, people. This looked more like it. Old school. Look at Aragorn wearing purple. Okay, when I first read the book, right? And we all did this. Us readers, we know. You can feel the book winding down. You're aware, like I feel where we are in the story. This can't go on forever, but I still got a little bit of ways to go, right? So I was thinking to myself, what's all this, right? Didn't know. But the story ends. Next page says the appendices, and I just loved it. It felt it made the book feel more real, right? Like it was an actual history that actually happened. Because I've never seen that, and even now, not a lot of fantasy books will do this. Add just reference material in the back of the book, like it's like a biography, where I'm just noting all my citations. Nobody does this. Who's putting this much work in, right? And to me, it really cements in my mind, on top of the good writing, the realism of everything that happened. It's fantastical as it is. And then it does something, and I'm going to sort of make a point here that carries, right? Because I've heard sort of things about this Rings of Power show on ye old interwebs that offend me a little bit. So it's going to come up. But it makes a point at the beginning of the appendices here to say that the source material for Durin's folk is Gimli the dwarf talking with Merry and Pippin. I mean, that's very specific, right? But why is that? Why does the source matter? You see? And no one ever wants to bring up sources on these books. They just want to say it's this, or that, right? And it technically is, right? It's all fake. It's all Tolkien. But if you want to go like in-house, in lore, there are rules that he establishes that he doesn't break from, that have bearing. Okay? So I'll be talking about that. So our main sources will be Merry, Pippin, hearing from Gimli, right? Bilbo, hearing from Elrod and Aragorn, and sort of Frodo, hearing from sort of those other two, maybe three as well. And I can even imagine if you're making a biography, you could take all these notes, you have them from all over the place, and you inherit some chunk from Bilbo of what he's already written, and then his notes. So Frodo's sitting there with a large pile of papers, right? Well, in the end, it'd be Samwise, right? Mayor of Hobbiton ends up with this big pile of papers. We're now in our third writer, and I'm having to sort of make a cohesive narrative, so to speak, out of this history. We get inconsistencies. Things become, incongruent. But it also shows biases, right? When you're talking from an elf's point of view, right? I'm talking to the elves. Everything elvish is kind of really great. Everything dwarvish is kind of eh. And men are kind of stupid. And then when you talk sort of from dwarves, we were sort of okay, and then the elves kind of mess stuff up, and men are kind of stupid. So everyone sort of has their point of view, but it's the history we have. History is this verbal thing passed on, so it's just part of the process. But it makes it feel very real. Um, we start in the appendices, and he gives us this about Numenor, which I mean it wasn't mentioned much in Lord of the Rings, just taste of it. So when I got to it, the name sounds cool to begin with. So I loved it to begin with. I'm like, Numenor. That sounds awesome. And we get into the high and low of them, how they came to be, how they came to not be, these sort of things. Very interesting. But one point I kind of like is how he shows the breakdown over 2,000 years or whatever it is. Because the Northern Kingdom, right? We end up with two kingdoms, Gondor, Arnor. The Northern Kingdom ends up with more of a Germanistic style issues, if you know the history of Germany. The king ends up with four sons, and he wants to give each son something, right? So he breaks the kingdom in four, because in his head they're brothers, they'll always sort of get along. We're family, but you can be king of here, and you can be king of there, and on we go. Well, it's never going to work. I don't think the brothers fought, but down the line, they end up sort of going at each other a little bit. And it sort of all coalesces around Amansul, Weathertop. Maybe my favorite name in the whole. I just love when he says the Great Watchtower of Amansul, because it's all the history, but just in this moment. I love it. But Amansul is Weathertop, and it's a large tower, and in the top we have the biggest palantir, right? And they all it's one of these lineage things, not a lineage. What am I thinking of? Uh, like a thing to boast about, right? It's a status. That's the word, status. Which because we're four kingdoms now, right? So one of us has to be better than the rest. Well, how do I decide? Well, we have our soccer teams play. Well, it's Middle Earth. I haven't invented soccer. So whoever protects Amansul got to be the best, right? So they sort of go to war over this. And that's when the Witch King of Angmar is sort of introduced in these histories. Well, they don't know he's the king, the head ring wraith at the time. We learn it later. But he comes down sensing this infighting and basically picks them off one by one. That's what he basically does. Tower gets destroyed. The Palantir doesn't get taken by him, but we don't know where it ends up. Very cool, and it's almost like an outline of the history, right? And you know that within each of this, he could go into much more detail. That's what's really interesting about his writing. Like if you get the timeline he shows here of what happened for Lord of the Rings, and then compare it to how much we get out of Lord of the Rings, you see an example of how in depth he could have gone in any of these points he's making. Um, we also get the word stewards. I had to sort of look it up in my. I have a guidebook. I'll show y'all later. The stewards were the name of the ancestors of the hobbits, right? So when Angmar, the king of Angmar, comes in, he's disrupting where they live. They can't stay in a war zone, so some go up to the Gladden Fields, others go here, and then some end up in the Shire, and from the Shire, we all know what's what. And it makes this point to say that some of these hobbits went to help these kings of the north in their wars against the Witch King. They were archers, I believe. And in my head, I can draw a very quick analogy. History repeats itself of one of these kings being like the Aragorn of his time, and some of these hobbits being like, your Frodo and your Pippin, where they inspire those people around them even more than the weight that they carry in war because they're not big, strong fighters. And I like that. I like the idea that this thing has happened before, it can happen again, this circular nature of history, linked to a completely made up book. It's very cool. Then they mention Tyrin Gorthad, which is the Burrow Downs. And this is also another bit of that who's talking, the perspective, right? Because that is history that predates men meeting the elves, which, again, you read some of like the Silmarillion or this or that. The elves see when they met man as a thing like it's where your nobility comes from as mankind is from this interaction. These Edain, they call them, I believe, were the first to cross the mountains and meet elves, so they are the best of humans. We're going to help them, and on we go. And is this right, wrong? I'm not sure, right? But to me, there's a hint that maybe that was the wrong way to go about it, right? The Valar helped the elves, and it went squirrely, and then they sort of backed off. Then the elves helped the men, and then it kind of goes squirrely, and then they back off. And so, it's sort of like you see this progression happening. But I like the idea that the Burrow Downs are man history, a history of men apart from elves, because they're on this side of the Blue Mountains, right? You don't meet elves until you cross the Blue Mountains, and then there are these elves, Fingold or whatever his name was. I forget the guy. You meet elves, and they become the Edain, and the Edain become Númenóreans, right? But to them, even the Dunedain after say this is a sacred area for us because something in history, some of our ancestors, this is our spot, and they'll stay in even though other people say it's cursed. The curses won't apply to you if they're your ancestors. So it's a very interesting little nugget there to say that humans, mankind, has views separate and apart from any nobility given to them by the elves. It's very interesting. I also like the fact that dwarves are this consistent strain throughout the books, right? Now, the elves build up this land and in their wars, which it's not saying that here, I just know this. In their wars, it gets sunk to the ocean, along with some of the Blue Mountains, along with some of the dwarven cities, but not all of them. You know, dwarves have lived in the Blue Mountains from the beginning of the Awakenings, almost, right up until Aragorn's time and past. They're just a very consistent force within the stories. Now, of course, when you hear from the elves, they're just hiding in their little holes looking for money, right? But when you read some of the other lore, a lot of evil crap just ends up in the mountains, right? Where they live. And they got to deal with it. But we don't hear about that because elves, right? Who wants to tell somebody else's history that makes them look better than you do? Nobody. Again, and it's subtle. It's not blatantly said, but you can see the lines of stuff happening here, right? What else do I got? The Southern Kingdom. How does the Southern Kingdom, which is Gondor, goes sort of a different route? I'm trying to think of who does this. More of a British or a Japanese style, in that you have the race that's Númenórean holding themselves as much higher. This is what gives us nobility over common people, which is fine, and they get a lot done. But as the years go on, obviously we're going to have more intermarriages, and they start to look down on that sort of thing. And it eventually comes to a head. I think one of the guys, Valakar, marries sort of like a Rohirrim woman-ish, right? I believe Rohan wasn't built yet, but they're from that area. In any case, from the Gondorians' point of view, she ain't Númenórean, so I'm not about that, right? And it starts a lot of infighting, and which infighting leads to a lot of other issues. But I like the idea that we have two different styles of kingdoms of infighting, and I like, we pull from these other strands to give it the flavor. It's a very interesting flavor. Then we get into the dwarves. Let's see if I say some of these names right. Wait. Azanul Bizarre. The caves above Keled Zaram. Hmm? Well, I forget why I wrote that down. I forget what mountain that is. Maybe I just wrote it because they sounded cool, right? In any case, we get to Khazad-dûm. I love saying it that way more than Moria. Khazad-dûm, right? They're just cool names. That's where old Durin woke up first. First of all the dwarves. First out of anyone, technically, I believe, because dwarves got made before everyone else, then went back to sleep. So in their head, I think they can hold their hat on. We were first. Of course, elves aren't going to like that. Issues. But they have held that almost essentially through all the other issues, right? So when Morgoth was there, Morgoth, who was above Sauron, who was even eviler, he couldn't crack him. He couldn't get into those mountains. They held him off. It's why the mountains were a problem, right? It's why they're a barrier, because dwarves are in there holding off. Do they get this credit from the elves? No. Biased? Hmm? Biased much? They held off through Morgoth. They held off through Sauron. And even Sauron when they were holding off in the Iron Hills, right? So they're entrenched in areas that make it so that even the evil the elves are fighting can't get through. And we have old Balrog down there. We have the Watcher in the water who was under the mountains. We have a lot of dragons go in there. We got a lot of evil stuff that's ancient. That some of it's even maybe older than Sheila. Probably, she's of a line that's beyond what was made by Morgoth. Not all the evil was Morgoth. He just sort of cultivated it. And they're in there dealing with this stuff, right? It says they were digging beneath Barazimbar. Love that crap. Love that name. It's what's Barazimbar is Caradros by the elves. Caradros the Cruel. So when in the movie, if you watch the movie, when they're going up in the snow and all the weather's coming. Now in the movie, I think they make it look like Saruman, but in the books, I believe that's just the mountain aggravated at them, right? Making their pass impassable. Well, he was also, I think, if you can sort of read it this way. He was holding a Balrog down there, right? And I believe if you read where Gandalf is chasing after the Balrog when he's fighting it, he has to follow it out. I'm like, it's a fight, but I don't know my way out of these caverns. The Balrog does, right? So I think you can get lost down there and not know the way out. Well, obviously when the dwarves dig down, there's my way out. You see? So they sort of released it. I think he was kind of being held by the mountain, which is a cool element. So the mountains are kind of like the trees and the eagles, where they're the elements of the world that are above even elves and men and everything else that's happening. They're these forces at work separately, right? So I think the mountain was trying to help them, right? Because the way it's described by the dwarves, right? Like they didn't know it was down there. Well, no, it says by that time the evil had awakened in the forest, but we didn't know that the evil was calling all evil towards it. The evil being ended up being Sauron, right? But okay, so when the Balrog comes up, Durin fights it. It's one of the ones later Durin, right? They get reborn. Durin fights the Balrog and he dies. And then his son, Nain, fights it and then he dies. So when it comes up, they fight it. And it overwhelms them and they have to leave. But when evil springs up in the woods, what does the Elf King do? Jack squat. He doesn't go fight Doguldur. He just leaves it. He's like, oh, I don't know, that's bad. Does he at least warn everyone that evil's awakened in the world again? No. Does he go warn the dwarves? Like, hey, there's evil in the world. Maybe they'd have checked. Like, maybe we should stop digging for a second and reinforce our stuff. Could that have happened? Possibly. You see? But the elves didn't do that. They just sat on their hands, and then this Balrog comes up, and then they blame the dwarves for being greedy. You see what I mean about the biases? Now, I know I'm pulling a lot out of it, but it's there to be pulled, right? Because this is Gimli talking, in a sense, right? Who has his bias against the elves, or had it until Legolas. But it's hard to break like a 120-year-old habit. All right, it lingers, but it shows up in this sort of small chunk of history, right? But no one wants to bring this up. Oh, elves are just perfect. I'm like, I don't know about that. Orcs, all orcs are elves. All right? That's your people, bro. That ain't my dwarves. It's all elves. Every orc is an elf. Twisted. Man, maybe he just chose bad and it shows up on his face. I don't know. Not saying, but I'm kind of saying. The war for the Silmarillions, that's straight Feanor. He could have just shared and we wouldn't have had this problem. That's all Feanor. The rings of power were made by elves. You know what I mean? Bringing a lot of problems they don't want to take credit for. All right. They also mentioned then sort of the rings of power, the Dwarven Rings mainly. And it mentions that the dwarves claim, at least Durin's folk, which are the ones that end up in Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, they at least claim their ring wasn't ever touched by Sauron. Now, obviously, the elves claim their 3 rings were never touched by Sauron. All the dwarven ones and all the men ones. And both elves and dwarves are pretty sure men are weak and stupid and all their rings were made by evil guy. But, it starts to get fishy, right? You see these inconsistencies. In any case, they say they're one, which I'm assuming if we could talk to the other dwarves of the Iron Hills and all the other races, they'd say the same about theirs, right? The Dwarven Seven weren't made by Sauron, is what they would probably say. But we don't have all of that. But I'm sure. And another thing which shows, and it's just a hint, Durin's folk say their ring is the first of the 7. It's another one of these status things, the same as the Amansul is for men. To say, we all have rings of power, but mine is the best because it's first. First to the scene is lead detective, so to speak, right? And so it hints to me that there are arguments even amongst the dwarves as to whose ring is the strongest or whose ring came first as to where we rank each other, which is very interesting. I love infighting shows sort of like the politics of these people. And every people's, no matter what, no matter how much they get along, they have politics, right? Can't escape that. And then we get to sort of another inconsistency, which I think may come from our various writers. But it's in here. Okay, Thor's ring. Hold on, let me see if I get this right. Thorin's dad is Thrain. Thrain's dad is Thor-er. And of course, the rings are going to go father to son, because that's what happens. Now, Thor gets it in his head, they say sort of inexplicably, right? To go retake Khazad-dûm, to go, I want Moria back. It belongs to my people. So he sort of wanders off with like a crew of 12. I don't know what they thought was going to happen. But he has a ring of power, right? But they are not sure what happens to it, because they say, we don't know what happened to the ring of power. It wasn't on Azog's body. Azog being the orc who killed him and mocked him, that caused the Goblin Wars. Wasn't on his body. That's what it says. There's a line in the Appendices that says this. Next paragraph, it says that Thrain lost his ring in Dol Guldur to Sauron. Right? And I'm like, how can it be both? Either you lost the ring in Moria, or you lost the ring in Dol Guldur. But wait, it gets even more complicated. Right? Because where did Gandalf get the map and the key that he gave to our boy Thorin Oakenshield? He found Thrain in a Dol Guldur prison out of his mind, and Thrain gave Gandalf a map and the key. So how, if you're imprisoned by Sauron and a bunch of dirty orcs and evil stuff, how were you able to hide a map and a key but not able to hide the ring of power, right? There's some inconsistencies, but we add to it the secrecy of dwarves, right? When it goes into their language, it says that they haven't taught their language to few, if any, outsiders. Period. We get a taste. We can see their language, but we don't hear it, which hearing it adds something to it, right? You don't know how to pronounce the words. You don't have the power of these words. And the power of words is a theme throughout Lord of the Rings. Oaths taken. I think the universe was made in song. This kind of thing. So that we hear some words from Gimli when he uses a battle shout, but it's not. It's a battle shout that's been heard before. But they say even their names. Gimli's not his dwarven name. So he's friends with Merry and Pippin, and he's not telling Merry and Pippin and Frodo his actual name, his dwarven name. They guard their language. All right, so you have now a secretive people and an inconsistency in what happened to this ring. We got to go with probabilities now, right? What probably happened? Now, I think because we either got to go, okay, he had the ring on him. Gandalf got the ring and the map and the key and got out of there, then gave the ring to Thorin and didn't tell anyone, which would need Gandalf to lie. And I'm not sure he's that much of he might keep a secret from you, but I don't know if he'd lie to everyone in a history of these events. I don't know if he'd lie. Maybe if he's sworn to it. So it's possible, but not as likely to me as Thor. Because I'll explain in a minute. Thor gets this idea to go take Moria. I think he gave his ring to his kid before he left for safe. Like my boy got it. If I don't make it, it's gone to him anyway, right? Then Thrain gets it in his idea years later to go as well. I think he gave it to Thorin. And why do I think this? Because they say sort of inexplicably, sort of these other two, Thrain I believe it says maybe, they got it in their head to do this sort of big thing, and they say Thorin is happy living his life, I think in the Blue Mountains, just getting along, and then they say his blood gets hot, that he all of a sudden has this urge to retake Erebor, right? He gets this idea in his head to retake Erebor. And I think that because they say that maybe the ring is what caused his dad to go to Cape Moria, but they don't say the ring caused Thorin. But I think if he had it and didn't tell anyone, because they're keeping the secret of who has this ring even from each other in family, not in clan. In a family, they don't tell everyone everything. I think he might have had that ring, right? I mean, it's possible. Balin later inexplicably wants to go retake Moria, and rest in peace, Balin. He dies, so maybe he had the ring too, and it's passed down to somewhere else, which makes me think, from a secretive people, that there's a high possibility that none of the Dwarven Rings are destroyed, right? They were able to hold off a lot of the forces, as strong as men, There's a massive attack from Sauron up towards them, and if the Lonely Mountain doesn't hold, then they get flanked, so to speak. This kind of thing. But he holds. Hmm? Hmm? It's a working theory. I think it sort of works. I mean, and there's a few words here in these appendices that sort of lead to as much. Now, it doesn't say all of that, obviously. Nowhere does it say all of that. Don't get it twisted. I'm just theorizing, but I think it holds. Okay, then we get into one of the main reasons I want to do this video. One of the main attacks I see against the Rings of Power, and it's they don't put beards on the lady type dwarves, right? Because they're like, they gotta have beards. I'm like, nah, that's not how I read it. All right, it reads. It reads. They are in voice and appearance, and in garb if they must go on a journey, so like to dwarf men that the eyes and ears of other peoples cannot tell them apart. Hmm? Now, does that mean they look exactly like the men? No. It says, what does it say? If they must go on a journey. What does that mean? To me, it means I think they get in disguise. I think when we see, because even they talk like when Frodo first gets to Bree, I believe, there's like a group of dwarves huddled off on the corner. They mention this a lot of little huddles of dwarves going about on their business of their own. I got to go here. I'm doing that. They don't talk to people what they're doing. They're secretive, right? They're trying to get their money, and they're secretive. Will they help you? I mean, in a pinch, right? They won't really turn on you. They might not go out of their way to help you, but I don't think they'd let you, if you're hanging by your fingertips, fall off a cliff. They'd pull you up. They're good people in the end. But let's say, because we don't have a high birth rate, at least that's what it says, right? We don't have it. And some of it, they say that some of the guys will get so focused on their lives, and they leave such long lives that they don't get too focused on a kid too early. Before you know it, you're 900 years old, and you just want to live your life. So some of them don't even have kids, right? So your birth rate isn't explosive, so to speak. So if you take damage to your population, you live with that damage a good while. Elves live with it sort of permanently because they're kind of full of themselves. But, not that permanent because there's a lot of orcs. But we don't talk about that because elves are perfect, right? Right? So let's say a dwarf lady got to get moved for a marriage or something like this, like the King of England one time. A daughter was coming from Germany. Some German princess was coming to marry the King of England, and it was very dangerous to get her from there and by boat, right? So this sort of happens in real history too. But I gotta move, like, let's say, a dwarven princess to unite these two clans and be richer or whatever. You don't just roam around with all these dirty orcs everywhere. They're less likely to attack if they don't see a maiden, if they just see like 12 dwarves, but the dwarves all know she's a lady, protect her over everything else, right? And maybe they're a bit more stout than your waif-like elf ladies, right? Hmm? So you just put on a beard, you dress like a man, and you get through the world until you're back safe underground. Right? That's my thinking, right? Because it doesn't say they have beards. At least not in the appendices. I'll probably bring this argument up again when I cover Les Silmarillion. You know I got it. I got it right there. You know I got the Silmarillion. Don't act. You know your boy got it. We'll cover it. It's a hot mess. It says that the dark years for the men of Middle-earth were the years of glory for Numenor. I love this separation, right? This idea that they're all on this island and everything's getting better for them. And then over here it's like the Middle Ages and it's, we're fighting each other with clubs, right? We're just in the dark. We have no knowledge and this and that. It's sort of also haughty, right? Because the Numenorians, because they hang out with elves, think they're sort of haughty. Yeah. and that they don't go to Middle Earth to share this knowledge. So by the time they do, they're seen as like this strange thing, and it causes issues, right? But it mentions this here. In one of the timelines, because I read every timeline and thought about what each of them meant, because I love this book. It says, I forget, I didn't put the date down. It's in there. It mentions the birth in Numenor of Silmarin. Right? Now, why? Because at some point, the line of Numenorian kings ends. Right? Well, what ends up happening is father, son, and we get to father, daughter. I think it's the first daughter. And you're like, what do? We have I forgot the word they used. But we have a rule where the women can't rule, it must be a man. So they pass over her and pick her brother to rule. He becomes the Numenorian king, which is, sort of the king's right. And this happens again. You go to British history, this happens in their history. I want as straight a line in my royalty as possible. At some point, there's a kink in the road, right? So this guy has a daughter, and all sons. Well, here we skip we skip the firstborn. Firstborn's always more important, but it's a daughter. We can't have that, so we'll go with the son. We're fine until it ends, right? Well, now I need some way to re-grab the nobility that the lines of birth gave. So what they do is they track it back up, and they're like, well, King George had a daughter, and she had a son, and whoosh, we're down to here, so you're the king, right? You be the king. So when in the book now, her line becomes the line of the faithful, meaning they get kind of haughty, the Numenorians. They don't want to follow the elves or the rules anymore. They stop using Elvish. They start using their own language. They stop following sort of the traditions they had. And I think the symbolism there is that when you went away from it, you cursed yourself to get ruined, right? But the faithful never wavered, right? That's what they say. We're talking about their history now, right? Biases. They never wavered, and they're from a direct line of the firstborn of the last, sort of that king of Numenor, right? Which goes right up to Elrod's brother. So our lineage is pure and upright and worthy, right? But it's a point to make sure we remember when this chick was born, so that we could follow the lineage right down to Aragorn, and then he could be a worthy king, right? Lineage is very important in royalty. There's only a few ways to get it, right? Yeah, there's only a few ways. You conquer everything. So by conquest, by birth, or by, decree from another king. Now, I think in England, one of the kings was named king by the king of France. Like, you're the king of England, that dirty backwater area. Run along. I'm going to go back over here and eat a croissant. But the birth is always very important, and I love that he put it in our timelines here, right? Another thing from the timeline, it says, Ar-Pharazôn set sail and lands at Umbar. First, Al-Pharazôn, cool name, right? Umbar, great name for a city. Great name. A lot of history to Umbar on itself. I'm not going to get into all of it. But what I like is the way this builds up the lore, right? Because if you and I, who aren't royalty, probably, go to Houston, right? This is the first time I'm entering Houston. Not that big a deal. Doesn't really matter. I'm just a dude. But if the king goes to Houston, it's a very big deal. Because he is consequential. Things around him move. He moves things, right? So this idea, the best example I have for you is JFK, right? Sort of if you picture him as a king, right? Everything the king did is important. And if you look at the JFK, I bet you could find the week of JFK's assassination, the 2 weeks of, the day of. I mean, books books following everything Lee Harvey Oswald did. Why do we follow Lee Harvey Oswald? Because he killed the king, right? If he never shot JFK, he's an anonymous figure in history. But he shot JFK, so now everything about him we track. We can track to the minute what, here he sat down and ate some chips. I'm like, we're tracking when he ate chips. We did the same with JFK. He lands at this time in Dallas. He turns at this time. He, takes a poop at that time. If he had not, then blah, 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 right? So we love to track these kings and leaders, and that it matters more. So like LBJ, the LBJ book, which I did a video of. The moment JFK is dead, he becomes the king, right? So now from this point of view, JFK, the story goes down, and there's this sort of sunset, quick sunset, because he got shot, but everything goes down. But then there's this new light, like, oh, there's a new king, so we have to now go all the way back to his beginning and build it. I need to track everything he did. How do you get to be king, right? So kingship, leadership, these power positions, it's always a major deal to track what they do, where they do it, and how, and because they'll circle back around, right? They'll circle back around and be important in other ways. These weird connections that have made in history. Lovely to look at. And that I love that Tolkien does this. I mean, he does it here as an example to Ar-Pharazôn, but he also does it with Aragorn. There's a long list, I think it's in these appendices. Might be somewhere else. I think it's in the appendices, like, here Aragorn goes to Lorien, sets foot in Lorien. Aragorn won't set foot back in Lorien. Last time Aragorn was in such and such. He's like, I can't step foot in Gondor yet. I've come in, but not officially, right? It matters that he's humble, right? And whatever he does, we sort of glaze it to make it nice, right? He could have just snuck in and out. He was sneaky. Kings aren't sneaky. He came in unnoticed, with no glory or fanfare, because he's so humble, to heal our Éowyn and all these people, and then humbly left to be in his tent, because he won't come in until he's the undisputed king of Gondor, right? You see how we do this? I love that in history. And you see it in more than one actual history book. You see this sort of thing, right? Love that crap. I love that they put it in. We go into a full-on genus, like a family tree of Merry, family tree of Pippin, family tree of Frodo, right? And I'm like, why? Well, one, Frodo ends up being the ring bearer, and Bilbo, so their family tree matters. But two, it says here, because like in these fable type stories, your deeds, once you do a thing, you're now above normal people, right? A heavyweight champion of the world was one of us. Then he became heavyweight champion. And now he's sort of like a mini king, and where he goes and what he does matters. When was Ali this, and Tyson, did that. These kind of, it's subtle, and we don't use it as much because we don't have as much royalty. But it applies, right? So what they end up doing is Merry becomes master, capitalized, master of Buckland. It's a zone in the Shire. Pippin becomes Thane, and Samwise becomes mayor, longest serving mayor. Tip of the hat to Sam. But Aragorn then comes, and he makes these three positions counselors of the Northern Kingdom, right? So when the king shows up in the Northern Kingdom, which is Arnor, mountains, Gondor, by the sea. When the king shows up in the Northern Kingdom, some of his counselors, because if you're like squire to the king, who is it? Louis the 14th did this a lot. He would just dispense things like, okay, you get to pour my milk when I have cereal in the morning, and you get to brush my hair, and you get to put on my coat. And these people would, like, these nobles, these rich guys were fighting for these positions, right? And you'll try and finagle your way to get to put the coat on the king, because you're now bigger than everyone else. Because if you know, like billionaires, what do? After you're a super billionaire, they're so bored of being so stinking rich that they buy like a baseball team. Like, I want to buy the Mets and make them good. And everybody's like, you can't make the Mets good. They're garbage. Well, I'm a billionaire and all I do is win, win, win. So I'm going to buy them and make them good. Get out of my way, right? So it's it's sort of like that where you want prestige that you can't buy at some point, right? So any kind of title given to you by a king is massively important. So that these three get these titles from Aragorn, King of the North and the South, majorly important. And it says that they travel over to Rohan and visit Gondor and these kind of things. I love the extra history, especially with Sam, right? His daughter ends up a maiden of Arwen, and she's super pretty and all this and that. So you're blessed by doing this good thing for the gods, which is sort of the fantasy element. And you're blessed by nobility from this king, that royalty element. Has such great elements in it. And I think that's about all I wrote. I have a sheet of paper over my iPad to stop the glare. So I have no idea how long this video was. But, I hope you enjoy it. I'm watching the show. I don't know if I'm going to break down every episode. I might not, actually. I'm mostly doing this to defend the show. Because they're saying, it's not Tolkien lore. That's not what happens in the Silmarillion. And I'm like, look. Okay, you know what? I'll get into it more in the Silmarillion when I do its breakdown. But, just Tolkien didn't write it either. Huh? A little nougat, right, to get you to come back for that video, right? All right. Well, thanks for watching. Buy my books. I'm out.